Hello and welcome to ATI 4205. This session will address the logistics related to the sourcing and supplier selection processes. Criteria will be developed to ensure proper supplier selection. The purchase order processing and transaction processing will be discussed, and supplier partnership and integration will be also addressed. The supply logistics are the logistics related to raw material, parts, or components coming from supplier or supplier of supplier. The company will establish the policies and the procedures of dealing with the supplier. That will include the sourcing process and selecting the proper supplier. Supplier can be integrated within the manufacturer or the company's logistical system. The supply logistics will identify purchase order requirements and processing. In addition, it will identify the buying and payment processes. Selecting a reliable supplier with high quality and fast response will maximize the value to the ultimate customer. A partnership and a chain of suppliers can be formed to react to sudden changes in parts availability, distribution, and/or shipping channels. As a guidance for the best practices to know if I'm doing good or not, and as an example of a successful supply chain, the Supply Chain and Operations Reference Model has been developed and endorsed by the Supply Chain Council. This model is called or abbreviated to SCOR, SCOR, and it shows the major operations required for each partner in the supply chain, all the way from the end user to supplier of supplier. The operations are the plan, the source, the make, the deliver, and the return. SCOR is a management tool used to address, improve, and communicate supply chain management decisions within a company and with suppliers and customers of a company. It's considered a framework that describes the business processes required to satisfy a customer's demand. It also helps to explain the processes along the entire supply chain and provides a basis for how to improve these processes. In the planning phase, it's considered as planning for demand, supply, inventory management, warehouse operations, and other logistical things. One of the things that should be planned for is risk and risk management. Risk of shortage in demand will be identified, and a risk management plan will be included. In the case of a natural disaster such as a hurricane or a pandemic, although it might be expected, and you can hear it in the news that a hurricane is coming, the existing plan might not fulfill the abnormal spike in demand. At that point, an ad hoc plan should be developed accordingly. The plan should include communication plans between the supply chain partners, and that means the flow of information between the partners. Determining business rules to improve and measure supply chain efficiently. The business rules will address inventory, transportation, assets, and compliance with federal and state regulations, and that's the flow of material. And then the financial plan for transactions between the partners, and that's the flow of money. The figure in this slide shows some of the logistical operations between a firm and their suppliers, such as order processing, transporting, storing, material management, inventory management, and physical distribution. Not to mention that we have within all that the transaction of money. As you can see, there is invoicement, and that's the invoicement is the flow of information, and the payment on the other side for transaction of money. With all these communications and shared operations, there is a need to manage the company's suppliers. The main goal is to ensure the organization continuously obtains the best value from external providers of products and services while controlling exposure to vendor-related risk. Vendor management lifecycle contains the governance and processes, which establish strategy and governance, define standard operation procedures, documentations, system, roles and responsibilities, who will do what in that process. Select a vendor. Then we select a vendor in accordance with a formal, unbiased practice to ensure the best fit for the product service requirements and the best value at the optimal exposure to vendor risk. Then we have manage vendor contracts. So we manage vendor contracts through the contract life cycle. We manage vendor risk. We manage vendor risk to protect the organization from negative effects that can be caused by events on the vendor's side. And we need to manage vendor relationships, which is maintain effective relationships with vendors. And we need to manage vendor performance, and that's to ensure that vendors perform as contracted. Over time, you can see that performance might go down, so having a continuous vendor performance evaluation will keep that vendor with the same performance as being contracted. As part of the supplier policy, a standard operation procedure should be created. The standard operation procedures are policies, procedures, and standards that the organization needs to establish to manage operations with vendors. The standard operation procedures can increase systems efficiency, thus increasing profit. It will create consistency and reliability in production and service, the services provided, which will reduce the error in most, if not all, areas of the firm. Since the standard operation procedures includes the policies with the supplier, it can resolve conflicts between the company and the supplier. Actually, it can define the roles and responsibilities of the involved parties. Over time, that will develop loyal relationships between the partners. Having standards for the company's operations with the supplier can be the first line of defense in any inspection, whether it be by a regularity body or a partner or potential partner, or a client or a firm conducting due diligence for possible purchase. Actually, it adds value to the business in case the company would like to sell and there is a possible purchase. Once the plan is developed, the company can start sourcing, which is the process of finding suppliers of goods and services. Selecting a vendor is a very critical decision. The quality of the company's performance and the quality of the product will depend on the selected vendor. The organization needs to develop criteria or techniques to measure the ability of a vendor in becoming a good supplier. The vendor selection process includes defining requirements, researching options, evaluating vendors, then selecting the vendor and negotiating the contract with that vendor. Vendor selection process might be affected by many factors, such as the type of the product that you are dealing with, the geographical location, proximity, climate, and other things, market condition, political stability, taxes, import-export regulations, cultural and social factors, company's operation strategy. All these factors will vary considerably if the vendor was in a different country. When you are on a global level, the politics, the taxes, the export regulations, the cultural and social factors will affect the company's decision. In the first step of the supplier selection, the organization must define major requirements of their operations. Those requirements will be translated into supplier characteristics. Characteristic requirements may include the following. You might look at the cost, the quality, the delivery, the location, the capacity, the flexibility, the lead time, the reputation, certifications, collaboration, customer base, financial health, social responsibility, and product development. Once you have the selection criteria in place, you must create the pool from which you will select a supplier. During this part of the process, you will want to consider the current supplier, because already you have current suppliers, so starting with the suppliers you have experience with and establish relationships is generally a good idea. Past suppliers, depending upon the reasons why they are past and not current, if they were dropped for reason that they are not providing the quality required, and then they worked on that and became within the standards of the company, then you can bring them back to the list. And then we look at competitors. You may be able to buy from a competitor if it's ethical and with low risk. Industry group, many of which are non-profit and maintain databases of member companies, recommendations and prior business relationships, perhaps created while working at other companies, and of course the internet, which offers countless opportunities to find, research, and contact potential suppliers. Vendor evaluation can be done through different methods. We can do it through mathematical, statistical, artificial intelligence, or scorecards. For example, in the scorecard selection method, the supplier selection contains all the important elements you required in a supplier. Scorecard method should be quantifiable and include supplier characteristics, the important strategic alignment factors you value, applicable business policies, and any constraints for management directive, governance or government regulations, contracts already in place, and other commitments can be considered all as constraints. At this step, make sure you are prioritizing your needs. Quality may be most important. Surprising to some, cost is often low priority. Low cost but poor quality, long lead time, late deliveries that can affect the product and lead to affecting the customer. For vendor evaluation, the company should gather from the identified suppliers or supplier in the form of a request for quote or request for proposal. A table will be created with the collected information to be used in the scorecard method to rank potential suppliers. Depending upon the complexity and or criticality of the product or service, you may select the highest ranking supplier. Recognize that while you are not required to pick the top scorer, moving too far down the list is a red flag, indicating the process was flawed. Choose more than one for further qualification. May include interviews, site visits, and other criteria. The example of this slide shows the supplier evaluation criteria and their weights. A score from 1 to 5 will be assigned to each criteria two or criterion based on their priority and importance. The sum of the weights multiplied by the scores for all criteria will be calculated, and the total score will be used for vendor selection. So the one with the highest score will be selected as the vendor. After narrowing down the list to a manageable number of best options, possibly just one, let the negotiation begin. Depending on the critical good or service, any kind of product, you may negotiate with just the top supplier on your scorecard, even if others remain on the list of potentials. These others, of course, are not told they are not number one until negotiations and agreements are completed. In case it didn't work with the first one, so you can choose the second one in the list, and you can adjust the contract. Based upon the complexity of the situation, lawyers may be involved at that situation. Negotiations with the supplier will be using one of the following approaches: either cost-based price model, supplier opens book to purchaser; market-based price model, price based on published auctions or indexed price; competitive bidding, used for infrequent purchases but may make establishing long-term relationship difficult. Negotiating with many suppliers could be like a long-term partnering with few suppliers. We could do virtual integration with supplier. We could use the Kertsu approach. We could use virtual companies that use suppliers on an as-needed basis. The many supplier strategy is commonly used for commodity products, although there might be other factors as mentioned in the previous slide. Cost might be the main reason for selecting a supplier from the group. Suppliers will be competing with each other to provide the lowest cost and adding other competencies as needed. Once a supplier selected, they will be responsible for technology, expertise, forecasting, cost, quality, and delivery. Actually, that will be stated in the invitation for bid or request for proposal information or quote as part of the requirements. In a long-term commitment strategy, the buyer would like to have relation with fewer suppliers that are dependable or who are dependable. Those suppliers are willing to get the product to the buyer just in time. They are also willing to contribute with their expertise in the design and technology. They will give you the feedback on what needs to be done, what adjustment need to be done. This commitment creates value through the economy, and the cost of changing supplier will be huge. Trade secrets and other alliance may be at risk. So usually non-disclosure agreement should be signed in this case. Next session we'll continue addressing supply logistics and commitments through various approaches like contracts and vertical integration and other approaches. In addition, we are going to address the performance of the vendor and how to measure the performance. That will be all for this session. Thank you and have a great day.